Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course U.S. History. Today we're going to be learning about the best part of slavery at the end of it. The abolitionist movement, you guessed it, would eventually lead to the abolishment of slavery everywhere in our nation. This movement was led by a few social reformers. No, Stan, not Mother Teresa. Stan, not the social reformers of India. I mean William Lloyd Garrison. That's better. And writers John Greenleaf. Dang it, Stan. And last but not least, Harriet Beecher Stowe. These people, along with many other pivotal rebellions, books, protests, and shedding of blood, would lead to one of the greatest movements in our history. The abolitionist movement is defined as when the nation valued personal freedom and believed all men were created equal. Mr. Green, didn't the founding fathers have slaves? Sure, me from the past, but nobody really cared what you did as long as you sounded good and you were rich. Just kidding. Well, not really. But that is why the abolitionist movement started with an emphasis on morals and not money, even if money did cause many of their controversies. Initially, the first solution to end slavery in the United States was just to send blacks to Africa. Simple, right? Wrong. The American Colonization Society wanted to make it seem this way, but in reality, the blacks had zero desire to be sent back because they were born in America. They had no relation to the country their ancestors had come from and were American for the most part. Some thousands did end up going back to Africa, but they were free, so it really had no impact anyway. One important supporter of this movement was Abraham Lincoln, but nobody really cared for what he had to say back then. The Second Great Awakening began in the 1830s, which was basically bringing up the point that slavery was not morally right. Seems pretty obvious for a society in which half the people saw slaves as animals, but it was a new thought for them. Out of this awakening rose Theodore Dwight Weld. That's it, Stan, you're fired, after you put up the right picture. Weld, thanks to the Tappan brothers, was able to attend Lane Theological Seminary in Ohio, where he heard from Lyman Beecher. If that name doesn't sound familiar right now, you're either illiterate or uncultured, because he gave birth to a revolutionary woman, but more on her later. Although Weld ended up being expelled, he continued to share his anti-slavery beliefs and created the American Slavery as It Is pamphlet. It's 1831, a brand new year, and William Lloyd Garrison publishes his first issue of The Liberator. In the words of Hamilton,
I will not equivocate on my opinion. I have always worn it on my sleeve. Even if I said what you think I said, you would need to cite a more specific grievance.
That's pretty much how Garrison felt, as he was unwavering in his position. Garrison also publicly burned a copy of the Constitution because it was lying about how all men were created equal. And if that isn't extreme enough, he proposed that the North should secede. He also founded the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833, which, you guessed it again, opposed slavery. David Walker was another radical abolitionist inspired by Garrison, and as a free man of color, he wrote a book called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens, in which he encouraged slaves to rise up against their masters to defend themselves. The quote, "Is no more harms for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is to take a drink of water when thirsty," was most commonly used among the slaves. Next, we have Frederick Douglass. After running away from his master, he was taken in by the abolitionists and soon became one of the leaders in the whole movement. Douglass wrote an autobiography that gave detailed insight into some of the things he witnessed and experienced while he lived on the plantation. One part of this book even discusses the master, Mr. Covey, basically forcing slaves to schoolie poop so he could have more slaves for free. It states, "As this addition to the human stock, Covey and his wife were ecstatic with joy. Mr. Covey himself had locked the two up together every night, thus inviting the result." Hard to believe they did not see how actually messed up this all was. During this time, the North and South had very radical ideas of each other. The North saw the Southerners as extremely cruel, and the South saw Northerners as liars. Many Southerners believed slavery was actually supported by the Bible and was overall a pretty good thing. Despite Northerner beliefs, it was possible for there to be slave owners who were actually good to their slaves. Although this does not make slavery right, it did defend the South against some of the Northerner radical beliefs, and that leads us to our mystery document. The rules are simple. I read this document, and if I guess it correctly, I get a brand new smartphone. But if I get it wrong, I'm stuck with this bad boy. A faithful servant and true friend, kindly and considerate, loyal and affectionate. The family he served honors him in death, but in life they gave him love, for he was one of them. Well, considering that this piece is very respectful and talks of servitude, I'm going to guess that it is the tomb of one of those house elves on Harry Potter. What do you mean it's the grave of a slave from the Old South? You mean to tell me that not every Southerner was a horrible person that cared for nobody except themselves? Guess I'm stuck with this one. The conflicts between the North and South began to result in limiting freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Southerners in the House passed the gag resolution, which basically said that all anti-slavery appeals would be rejected without even being discussed. Next, post offices in the South were getting destroyed so often due to anti-slavery propaganda flooding through, so the government figured an easy fix to this was just to order the post to destroy the mail for them. This way, there would be no need for a tax. Surprisingly, revolts against abolitionists did not just happen in the South. Many Northerners condemned the extreme abolitionists for their harsh words and actions. A lot of people in the North didn't even want to abolish slavery. They just wanted to end the expansion, and these people are what we know as free soilers. Now, remember when I mentioned that people should recognize the name Beecher? In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published a book so influential that it is said that when Abraham Lincoln met her, he said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." This book was none other than Uncle Tom's Cabin, arguably the most influential book in history. Harriet was able to put the horrifying issue of slavery on paper, which was able to unify not only the northern states, but countries around the globe. This book was full of pathos that made people in the North want to do anything they could to stop this tragedy. However, according to the South, the book contained no ethos or credibility, as Harriet Beecher had never really seen slavery in her life, except for a getaway in Kentucky and living in Ohio for a while. Another book was written during this time period called The Impending Crisis of Slavery by Hinton Helper. Despite Helper's extreme racism, he gave supporting evidence as to why slavery should not exist, which was mainly because it hurt whites that did not own slaves economically. Despite the very different tones in these two books, they both helped unite and inspire people around the world. Because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, both territories were open to popular sovereignty. Northerners were already moving west, but some companies would pay to send Northerners into the Kansas Territory in order to make up for the Southerners moving there from Missouri. This infuriated Southerners because it was starting to look as both territories were going to become free. When Election Day rolled around, the South sent pro-slavery supporters from Missouri to vote. They won this election unfairly and set up a government in Shawnee. Free Soilers refused to accept this and set up their own government in Topeka. There were now two governments in the Kansas Territory, and neither of them were formed correctly or justly. Things escalated very quickly when some pro-slavery citizens burned down a Free Soil town. In order to get revenge, John Brown, his 5 sons, and some other extreme followers traveled to Pottawatomie Creek, where they killed 5 men by chopping at them until they died. I'm sorry, but how is this supposed to fix anything? Violence erupted in Kansas, which is why Kansas was called Bleeding Kansas during this time period. Violence also made its way into the government when Senator Charles Sumner, already disliked by most of the senators, gave an extremely demeaning speech which he blamed pro-slavery citizens and senators for Kansas's war. One of these senators was Andrew Butler, who was very popular with the Senate. He was absent, but his cousin Preston S. Brooks defended his honor, which leads us to our thought bubble. Brooks stormed into the room where Sumner was sitting at his desk, which was very unfortunately bolted to the ground. Brooks began to beat Sumner with his cane until his cane eventually broke. Sumner had no way to escape and had to take this brutal beating. Brooks was sent numerous canes to replace the ones he used to beat Sumner. Sumner was sent to Europe for over 3 years so that he could recover. This incident gave a pure example of how the North and South clashes were only going to get more heated. Back in Kansas, the citizens were trying to make the Kansas Territory a state, which meant the issue of slavery had to be decided upon. In order to try and trick Free Soilers into voting for slavery, the pro-slavery group had the citizens vote on the Lee-Compton Constitution. Not the Constitution as a whole, however, but just as it should include slavery or not. What the pro-slavery group knew was that no matter what, the owners of the slaves would be protected, leaving slavery no matter what. Free Soilers boycotted this election, which caused slavery to win. President James Buchanan supported the Lee-Compton Constitution, but the Senate still had to approve. Stephen Douglas, however, came to save the day, refusing this constitution. He sacrificed his chance of becoming president in order to make sure the entire constitution was put up for a vote. Obviously, the abolition of slavery would not come easy. All these events would end up in not only tearing the political parties apart, but the whole country. Through the speeches, books, riots, rebellions, violence, and Second Awakening, the issue of slavery was brought up from different points of view, which strengthened the feeling of loathing between the North and the South. Slavery was a dark time in our history, but as we learn about the country handling its positions, we can observe their mistakes to keep them from happening again. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.